The morning sun hit the penthouse with a cruel clarity, the kind of light that offered no mercy to those with secrets. For Rex Maddox, this brilliance was an intruder. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the city he ruled, a concrete labyrinth where people hurried toward lives he no longer understood. From this height, the world looked small, yet the emptiness inside his immaculate black suit felt vast. To the city below, he was a ghost story, a name whispered in dark corners to silence the bold. Rex was the man who never looked back, a titan of blood and loyalty whose iron will had built an empire. But as the quiet of the room pressed against him, he found himself haunted by the one person he couldn't intimidate. Years ago, Rex had been a different man. Before he was a king of shadows, he was simply a man who had promised Monica Monroe a world that was safe and bright. Monica had loved him when his pockets were empty and his only asset was a relentless ambition. They had shared small dreams in quiet rooms, moments where she asked for nothing but his presence. But as Rex's influence grew and his business crossed into the poisonous territories of violence and betrayal, the man Monica loved began to disappear behind a mask of rigid power. He convinced himself that his coldness was a shield, that by pushing her away, he was keeping her alive. Meetings replaced their shared evenings. Bodyguards became the only family they knew. He didn't notice that while he was building a fortress to protect her, he was actually constructing a prison of loneliness. It was during this slow drift into darkness that the temptation to leave entirely took root. He stood now with his back turned to her, his jaw tight, believing that walking out was his final act of strength. He was prepared to abandon the only heart that truly knew him, unaware that Monica was about to strike the one part of him his enemies could never reach. His pre-death sunlight hitting the penthouse glass was a reminder of the harsh reality Rex tried to escape. But as he stood frozen by Monica's voice, the light seemed to warp, pulling him back to a night where the air was softer and the world felt infinitely smaller. It had been 4 years since that evening on the coast, a night draped in the scent of salt air and the quiet hum of a life that hadn't yet been stained by blood. Monica had stood on the balcony of their first real apartment, wearing a white dress that fluttered like a flag of peace against the dark horizon. Rex remembered the weight of the ring in his pocket, a modest stone that represented every cent he had scraped together before the Maddox name became a curse whispered in the shadows. When he had dropped to one knee, the rigid posture he held now was non-existent. He had been a man of hope, not a man of iron. "I'll build an empire for you, Mon," he had whispered as he slid the gold onto her finger. "A world where no one can touch you, where you'll never have to look over your shoulder." He had pressed his forehead against hers, making a vow that felt as solid as the ground beneath them. "I will keep you safe, always." Monica hadn't asked for the empire. She had only looked at him with dark, trusting eyes and said, "I don't need a fortress, Rex. I just need you to stay whole." But the safe world Rex promised slowly transformed into a gilded cage of violence and secrecy. As his business crossed into dangerous territories, the white dress of her innocence was replaced by the mourning black of a woman waiting for a man who was already losing his soul. He had convinced himself that the bodyguards and the armored cars were the fulfillment of his promise, failing to see that the poison of his lifestyle was the very thing he had vowed to protect her from. Now, in the brutal clarity of the penthouse, that white dress was no longer a symbol of their future, but a haunting reminder of the promise he was currently breaking. He was walking away to save her, yet as she called him a coward, he realized with a jolt that his vow to keep her safe had become his greatest excuse to hide from the fear of truly being known. The man who had once knelt in the sand was now a stranger to the woman who had never stopped believing in him. The stillness of the penthouse was a thin veil, easily torn by the memory of the night the poison finally touched the one thing Rex Maddox had tried to keep pure. It had happened only 3 months ago, a cold Tuesday that had started like any other, with Rex believing his power was a wall that could stop the world from bleeding into his home. He had been a name whispered in dark corners, a man who never hesitated. Yet he had forgotten that shadows have a way of creeping under even the most expensive doors. They were leaving a charity gala, the air filled with the hollow praise of people who feared Rex more than they respected him. Monica was beside him, her laughter a soft melody that usually silenced the noise of his power. She was his only tie to humanity, the only thing that made him feel more like a man and less like a ghost story. But as they approached the car, the rhythmic clicking of her heels was drowned out by the sudden, violent roar of a motorcycle and the staccato rhythm of gunfire. Rex had reacted with a rigid, practiced instinct, shielding her with his own back, the same back he was now using to walk away from her. He had felt the heat of the bullets passing through the air where her heart had been just a second before. He had heard her gasp, a sound of absolute terror that cut through his armor like a blade. In that moment, the immaculate black of his suit felt like a target, and her white dress looked like a shroud. The attack was over in seconds, leaving behind only the smell of gunpowder and the realization that his world was a death sentence for anyone standing too close to him. He had looked at Monica's face, pale, trembling, and covered in the shattered glass of their illusion, and seen the annihilation he had always feared. He realized then that his empire was built on a foundation of betrayal and death, and as long as she was with him, she was a promise he was destined to break. It was that violent reminder that had planted the seed of his departure. He had convinced himself that his world was poison, and that loving her was a crime he couldn't afford to commit. Every instinct he perfected over years of ruling by fear told him to keep moving, to remove himself from her life, to keep her breathing. He had stood at the edge of the room today, his posture rigid, believing that by walking out, he was finally fulfilling that old vow to keep her safe. The days following the shooting felt like a slow descent into a cold, clinical reality where Rex Maddox was forced to view his life as a series of tactical errors. Every time he looked at Monica, he no longer saw his partner. He saw a liability in his enemy's eyes, a fragile point of failure in the fortress he had tried to build. The fear of losing her wasn't just an emotion anymore. It had become an operational reality that paralyzed his judgment. He began to believe that his very presence was a magnetic force for violence, drawing the darkness of the city toward her light until she would eventually be consumed. He spent long, solitary nights in his office, watching the city lights and realizing that the success he had chased had become a cage that trapped them both. He convinced himself that as long as they were together, the poison of his business, the secrecy, the bodyguards, and the constant threat of betrayal would be the only air she got to breathe. He remembered her early simple dreams of his presence, but he felt he had already lost the man who could give her that. He felt a strange emptiness growing inside him, as if he were already mourning the life they had built together. In his mind, the math of his world was simple and brutal. His exit was the price of her life. He started to view walking away not as an act of abandonment, but as the final, ultimate sacrifice of a man who loved her enough to become her memory. He told himself that clarity would make everything easier for her, that a clean break was kinder than the slow corrosion of a love that had nowhere sustainable to land. He decided that he would become a name she used to know, a ghost that no longer haunted her doorstep, ensuring her future by removing himself from it entirely. As he finalized the plan to leave, his jaw tightened with a rigid determination. He believed he was choosing the noble path, the one where he carried the weight of the loneliness so she wouldn't have to. He didn't realize that his pride was crafting a story to protect his own ego from the vulnerability of staying. He stood in the penthouse, his posture immaculate and his heart shielded, fully convinced that by walking out, he was finally becoming the hero of a story that required him to be the villain. The sunlight pouring through the penthouse windows painted everything in cruel clarity. There was nowhere to hide, not from the truth, and not from her. The brilliance of the morning served only to expose the cracks in the armor Rex Maddox had spent years forging. He stood at the edge of the room, his tailored black suit immaculate, his posture rigid. To the world, he was a name whispered in dark corners, a man who never looked back, but the phone in his hand trembled slightly, betraying the calm mask he had perfected through years of ruling fear and blood. Behind him, Monroe stood frozen. Her white dress clung to her like a promise he had once made but was now breaking, her chest rising and falling unevenly as she watched his retreat. Her dark eyes were fixed on his back, the same back that had shielded her from a world that wanted to consume him whole. And now, that same back was walking away, leaving her in the very silence he had promised to protect her from. "Rex," she said softly. He didn't turn. He couldn't. He knew that if he caught a glimpse of the grief on her face, the rigid wall of his resolve would crumble, and he might never find the strength to leave again. His jaw tightened as every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to finish the amputation of their lives. He believed his world was poison, a death sentence she didn't deserve, and that removing himself was the only mercy left. He took another step toward the door, the sound of his shoes on the polished floor echoing like a final gavel strike. He convinced himself that he was being strong, that this was the ultimate sacrifice of a man who loved someone enough to become their ghost. But the sunlight followed him, illuminating the trembling of his hands and the tension in his shoulders, stripping away the lie of his indifference. Then she spoke again, her voice sharper this time, cutting through the heavy air and his carefully constructed defense like a blade. "You're not walking away because you're strong," she said, the words landing with a weight that made the floor feel unstable beneath him. "You're walking away because you're afraid." His breath hitched and his body froze. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, a vacuum where his pride and his fear collided. For the first time in his life, Rex Maddox, a man who never hesitated, found himself paralyzed by a truth he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. The accusation hung in the air, more lethal than any bullet Rex had ever dodged. For a man whose entire identity was built on the pillars of iron-willed courage and absolute control, being called a coward was an annihilation of his self-image. He remained motionless, his back still turned, but the rigid lines of his shoulders seemed to buckle under the weight of her words. He had faced death without hesitation, stood down rivals with a glance, and walked through fire to build an empire of blood and loyalty. Yet, in this sun-drenched room, he felt stripped of his rank and reduced to a fraud. Slowly, Rex turned. The movement was heavy, as if he were fighting the gravity of his own lies. Monica stood there, trembling but unbroken, her dark eyes fixed on him with a piercing intelligence that saw through the tailored black suit and the cold, immaculate mask. Tears glistened on her cheeks, catching the cruel light of the penthouse, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted him to see the wreckage his strength had caused. "You think this is noble?" she whispered, her voice cutting through the suffocating silence. "You think walking out that door makes you a martyr?" She took a step closer, her white dress rustling like the ghost of the promise he was currently murdering. "It's the easiest thing you've ever done, Rex. It's easier to be alone in your fortress than to stay here and let someone truly see you." He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. He wanted to roar, to tell her about the motorcyclist and the staccato rhythm of gunfire, to remind her that his world was poison. He wanted to justify the bodyguards and the armored cars as proof of his devotion, but the words died in his lungs. He realized that his martyr complex was just an elaborate tactical retreat. "You're not leaving to save me," Monica said, her voice breaking as she reached the heart of his secret. "You're leaving because if you stay, you'll belong to me. And that terrifies you more than any enemy ever could." The truth hit him with a force that made his lungs seize. He had spent years ruling by fear, but he had never understood its true nature until this moment. He wasn't afraid of losing his life. He was afraid of losing his independence, of the annihilation that came with being known, held, and loved. His hand loosened at his side, the phone nearly slipping from his numb fingers. He stared at her, his expression cracking for the first time in his adult life. The most feared man in the city was finally cornered, not by a weapon or a rival, but by the devastating reality of his own cowardice. the silence that followed her accusation was not empty. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that filled the penthouse until the air felt as thick as iron. Rex Maddox stood paralyzed, the word afraid echoing in the chambers of his mind like a recurring nightmare he had tried to bury under a mountain of power and blood. For a man whose name was whispered in dark corners to command obedience, the label was a poison he had no antidote for. He had built his entire existence on being the predator, the one who never looked back, the one who never hesitated. To be afraid was to be human, and to be human was to be breakable. His body remained frozen, a statue of tailored black silk and rigid muscle, while his mind fractured. He thought of the rivals he had silenced and the bullets he had ignored, trying to use those memories as a shield against Monica's gaze. He told himself that a man who rules fear cannot be ruled by it. But the logic of the street didn't apply here. This wasn't the fear of an assassin's blade or a hostile takeover. It was the fear of being seen in the cruel clarity of the morning light. It was the terror of realizing that his absolute independence was merely a high-walled prison he had built to keep himself from belonging to anyone. He felt the phone in his hand tremble again. A betrayal of the calm mask he had perfected over years of ruling through fear and loyalty. Every empire he had built, every victory he had won, suddenly felt like an elaborate distraction from the truth Monica had just dragged into the light. He had convinced himself that he was walking away to protect her, but as the silence stretched, he realized that he was the one who needed protection. He was afraid of the annihilation that came with being known not as a ghost story or a mafia king, but as a man who needed the woman standing behind him. The most feared man in the city was cornered by 5 simple letters. The word afraid had stripped away his rank, his suit, and his history, leaving him standing in the center of his luxury apartment feeling strangely empty and small. His jaw remained tight, his breath hitched in his chest, as the psychological weight of her words settled into his bones. He was the frozen king, trapped on a throne of his own making. Realizing for the first time that losing her wouldn't be a tactical defeat, it would be the end of the only thing that made him human. Slowly, Rex turned, the movement heavy as if he were fighting the gravity of his own lies. The immaculate mask he had perfected through years of ruling fear and blood finally began to crack, betraying the rigid posture of a man who never looked back. Monica stood there, trembling but unbroken, her dark eyes fixed on him with a depth of pain that the morning light rendered in cruel clarity. Tears glistened on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted him to see the wreckage his strength had caused. When his gaze finally met hers, the impact was harder than any bullet he had ever dodged. He saw the annihilation she had spoken of, but it wasn't his own, it was the reflection of the woman he was murdering with his silence. Her dark eyes, usually filled with a trust that had shielded him from his own darkness, were now fractured by the realization that the man she loved was willing to become a ghost story. Rex stared at her, his expression cracking for the first time in his adult life, the immaculate armor of his tailored black suit suddenly feeling like a target. He saw the uneven rise and fall of her chest and realized that her white dress, which clung to her like a broken promise, was the only thing holding her together. To the world, he was a name whispered in dark corners, but to Monica, he was a man who was currently failing the only test of courage that mattered. Looking at her, he understood that losing her wasn't a physical threat. It was the erasure of the only part of him that remained human. Every instinct that had screamed at him to keep moving, to protect her by leaving, fell silent under the weight of her grief. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a tactical shield. It was an open wound. Rex swallowed hard, his throat dry, as he stood cornered by the woman he loved. He had faced death without hesitation, but facing the truth in her eyes required a courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The most feared man in the city stood frozen, not by a weapon or an enemy, but by the sight of a heart he had promised to protect and was now systematically destroying. In that moment, the powerful mafia boss ceased to exist. replaced by a man realizing that his empire meant nothing if he couldn't hear her laugh afterward. Monica took a slow step forward, the movement small but enough to make the air between them feel even thinner. She didn't look at the tailored suit or the cold, immovable jaw that Rex used to silence his enemies. She looked straight into his dark eyes, searching for the man who had knelt in the sand years ago. Those hidden places, buried under layers of violence, betrayal, and the heavy noise of power, were finally being dragged into the cruel clarity of the morning light. Rex stood rigid, his breath hitched in his chest, as she began to dismantle the architecture of his solitude. "You think you've killed that part of yourself," she whispered, her voice breaking with an honesty that dug deeper than any blade. "You think if you stay away long enough, if you build enough walls, you'll forget what it feels like to actually be known." She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his arm, a quiet warning he chose to ignore. Rex swallowed hard, his throat dry as he realized she wasn't talking about his empire or his name whispered in dark corners. She was talking about the dreams they had built together in small rented apartments. Monica's words struck him harder than he expected, peeling back the mask of the powerful mafia boss to reveal the strangely empty man underneath. She spoke of the quiet expressions of care he had taken for granted, the long conversations about their future, and the simple laughter that had once echoed through their early days. She exposed the truth that he was not protecting her by walking away. He was protecting himself from the vulnerability of staying. He had convinced himself that his world was poison, but Monica saw the truth he had tried so hard to ignore, that losing her would not be a tactical loss, but a total annihilation of the only part of him that was still real. Every empire he had built and every victory he had won suddenly felt hollow against the weight of her gaze. He had spent years chasing success, not noticing that the very power he sought was pulling him away from the only person who truly understood his heart. As she whispered the truth of his fear, the rigid posture Rex had perfected for years began to buckle. The hidden places he thought were dead, the parts of him that still needed her presence and her laughter, were suddenly, painfully alive. In the suffocating silence of the penthouse, the most feared man in the city stood exposed, realizing that the truth arrives so late. Sometimes the damage is already done. Rex stood at the edge of the room, his dark eyes fixed on the city he had conquered. Yet the sprawling skyline now looked like nothing more than a graveyard of his own making. The sunlight pouring through the penthouse windows continued its relentless exposure, stripping the glory from the mahogany and marble until the room felt as cold and sterile as a vault. Every empire he had built, every rival he had silenced, and every locked door his name had opened suddenly felt like ash in his mouth. He had spent years chasing a success that he believed would act as a shield, but as he stood frozen by Monica's words, he realized he had only succeeded in building a fortress where he was the sole prisoner. The silence after her accusation became louder than any noise in the city below. Rex looked at his hands that had perfected the art of ruling through fear and blood, and saw how empty they truly were without the weight of the promise he was currently breaking. He thought of the victories that had once felt so vital, the moments of power that had made him feel unstoppable, and realized they were hollow echoes compared to the simple presence of the woman standing behind him. He had convinced himself that he was doing everything for her. Yet in the cruel clarity of the morning, he saw that he had been chasing shadows while the only thing that made him human was slipping away beyond his reach. Every birthday wish he had ignored, every family dinner he had replaced with a meeting, and every moment he believed could wait now felt like an irreversible mistake. He had believed his world was poison, but the true toxin was the realization that he had sacrificed the small, real moments for a title that left him strangely empty inside. Looking at Monica, he understood that a life without her laughter afterward was not a victory. It was a slow, agonizing annihilation. The most feared man in the city realized that his power was a distraction, a heavy noise that had prevented him from hearing the quiet truth. He had won the world, but in the process he had lost the only home he ever had. Monica's dark eyes fixed on his back, refusing to let him retreat into the shadows of a noble lie. The sunlight continued to paint the room in cruel clarity, exposing the rigid posture Rex maintained as he tried to justify his departure as a final act of mercy. He had convinced himself that his world was poison and that by removing himself, he was granting her a life she deserved, one free from the violence and betrayal that followed his name. He wanted to believe that walking away was the ultimate sacrifice of a man who loved her enough to become a ghost. "Don't you dare call this protection," Monica whispered, her voice sharper now, cutting through his immaculate armor like a blade. She refused to be the victim in his tragedy or a daughter of a world he thought he could curate by leaving. She stood trembling but unbroken, her chest rising and falling unevenly as she challenged the very foundation of his exit. To her, his martyrdom was nothing more than a tactical retreat from the vulnerability of actually staying. She didn't want to be saved from his world if it meant losing the man who had once shielded her from everything else. She stepped closer, her white dress rustling like the promise he was currently breaking. Rex's jaw tightened as her words dug into the hidden places he had buried long ago. He had faced death without hesitation, yet he stood frozen as she stripped away his excuses. Monica made it clear that a life without him wasn't safety. It was just a different kind of annihilation. She wanted him to understand that every empire he built meant nothing if she wasn't standing beside him, and that his attempt to save her was merely an attempt to save himself from the terror of truly belonging to someone. The silence in the penthouse became heavy and suffocating, as the most feared man in the city realized his noble sacrifice was a lie. Rex stared at her, his expression cracking for the first time as the truth hit him harder than any bullet ever had. He had convinced himself that clarity would make everything easier, but looking at Monica, he saw only the wreckage of a love he was trying to abandon. She wasn't his weakness, and she wasn't someone who needed his distance to survive. She was the only thing that made him human. Rex stood at the edge of the room, his immaculate black suit feeling like a leaden weight as the sunlight stripped away his remaining defenses. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of the cold, rigid posture, a man whose name alone could silence arguments and open locked doors. He had stood in the path of bullets without flinching and looked into the eyes of assassins with a calm that bordered on the inhuman. To Rex, physical danger was a familiar language, a calculated risk he knew how to manage with blood and loyalty. Facing death was easy. It required no heart, only an instinct for survival, but facing Monica was different. As she stood there, trembling but unbroken, Rex realized that the courage he had used to rule the city was useless here. He stared at her, his expression cracking for the first time, realizing that losing her wasn't a physical threat, it was annihilation. He looked at her hand, a small, pale promise of a future he was currently breaking, and felt a terror that no enemy could ever inspire. To reach out and take that hand, to stay and belong to her, required a bravery that his world of poison and violence had never taught him. He had convinced himself that walking away was strength, but her words had exposed the truth. It was a tactical retreat from the vulnerability of being known. Every instinct he had perfected as a man who never looked back screamed at him to keep moving, yet he remained frozen. He realized that his empire, built on fear and power, was a hollow fortress designed to protect him from the very thing he now craved. He had faced death with a steady hand, but the thought of truly staying, of letting someone see the man beneath the name whispered in dark corners, made his breath hitch in his chest. The silence in the penthouse was heavy and suffocating, a vacuum where his pride finally met its match. For the first time in years, the most feared man in the city didn't know what to do. He understood that the bullets and rivals were nothing compared to the devastating honesty in Monica's dark eyes. Facing her required a different kind of courage, the courage to stop being a ghost story and start being a man. He stood on the precipice of his own transformation, caught between the safe solitude of his empire and the terrifying, beautiful risk of the woman he loved. the heavy silence that had anchored Rex to the floor finally began to shift. The rigid architecture of his resolve collapsing under the weight of a single devastating truth. He stood at the edge of the room, the sunlight still painting his immaculate suit in that cruel, unforgiving clarity, but the man who never looked back was gone. The phone, once a cold symbol of his detached authority, felt like a leaden weight in his hand until he finally let it go. A small surrender that echoed through the vast emptiness of the penthouse. He didn't turn with the calculated grace of a predator. Instead, he moved with the heavy, uncertain steps of a man who had just realized he was walking into the only fire that could actually burn him. His jaw, which had been set like iron for years of ruling through fear and loyalty, finally loosened, and the calm mask he had perfected through blood and betrayal began to dissolve. He looked at Monica, standing there trembling but unbroken in her white dress, and for the first time, he didn't see a liability to be protected or a weakness to be managed. He saw his life. The instinct to flee, to protect her by becoming a ghost story, was silenced by the realization that his empire was nothing but an elaborate distraction from his own hollow heart. He took a step toward her, then another, the distance between them feeling like a bridge over an abyss he had spent 7 years constructing. Every empire he had built and every victory he had won felt like ash as he finally reached her. His hand, the same hand that had never hesitated in the face of death, reaching out to touch her face with a terrifying, beautiful uncertainty. "You're right," he whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that would have horrified his enemies but finally made him whole. The word "afraid" no longer felt like an insult. It felt like a confession. He was afraid of the annihilation that came with belonging to someone, but he was more terrified of the man he would become if he walked out that door. In that moment, Rex Maddox didn't just choose to stay. He chose to be human. The most feared man in the city stood frozen no longer, closing the space between them until the only thing left was the woman who had dared to see through the legend to find the man hiding in the dark. Rex stood in the center of the penthouse. The silence no longer a tactical vacuum but a space where his old life was being systematically dismantled by the truth. For years, he had operated under the belief that being feared was his only protection, a name whispered in dark corners to ensure his absolute independence. He had equated belonging to someone with annihilation, a vulnerability that a man of his rank could never afford. Yet, as he stood before Monica, the rigid architecture of his pride felt like a heavy noise that had finally faded, leaving him alone with thoughts he could no longer ignore. The cruel clarity of the morning light stripped away the illusion that his empire of blood and loyalty made him whole. He looked at Monica, seeing her not as a liability or a weakness, but as the only thing that made him human. He realized that the annihilation he had feared wasn't the end of his life, but the end of the ghost story he had become. Every victory he had won and every enemy he had silenced felt like ash compared to the simple, terrifying reality of being known by the woman he loved. He was no longer a man who never looked back. He was a man who understood that his power was a prison and his solitude was a lie. The choice to stay required a different kind of courage, one that didn't involve bullets or betrayals. It required him to lower his guard and accept that his world of poison was hollow without her presence. He took a breath, his chest rising and falling unevenly, finally accepting the weight of her words that losing her would destroy him because he had finally found a home in her heart. The most feared man in the city allowed himself to be seen, his expression cracking as he chose the vulnerability of belonging over the safety of his throne. He understood now that some mistakes cannot be undone, but staying was the only way to repair the damage his silence had caused. The sunlight hitting the penthouse was no longer a cruel exposure but a testament to the truth that had finally set Rex Maddox free. He stood in the center of the room, his rigid posture finally broken, replaced by the heavy, honest weight of a man who had chosen to be human over being feared. He looked at the engagement ring he had once nearly abandoned, a modest promise from a night of salt air and hope, and, realized that the empire he had built was merely a fortress to protect, a heart he had been too afraid to share. Slowly, Rex closed the distance between them, his hand no longer trembling with the agitation of a secret departure, but reaching out to take hers with a terrifying, beautiful certainty. He didn't offer a dramatic speech or a tactical apology. He simply stood before Monica, his immaculate mask dissolved, and looked into her dark eyes with the full weight of a man who had finally come home. The silence that followed was no longer a tactical vacuum, but an inhabited space where the promise he had once made could finally take root. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice steadying as the truth arrived, not as a tactical defeat, but as a guide. He acknowledged that his attempt to save her by walking away was the ultimate lie of his own pride. He vowed then, not to a name whispered in dark corners, but to the woman who had dared to see through his legend, that he would no longer fight the world without her. If his lifestyle was a poison, they would find the antidote together. If his world was a death sentence, they would rewrite the ending as a team. Monica squeezed his hand weakly, but with a kindness that hurt him more than any enemy ever could. A soft acceptance of the man he was becoming. Rex realized then that she had never wanted his success or his power. She had only wanted his time and his presence. As he stood there, holding her hand in the quiet morning light, the most feared man in the city finally understood that the most dangerous thing he had ever done wasn't facing a bullet, but staying to be loved. The promise was no longer a white dress fluttering in the wind. It was an anchor in the storm of his life, a reminder that the truth always finds its way home.